It's 10:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, a perfect canvas of deep blue under scattered white clouds. 30,000 feet below, four of the most powerful warships ever built cut through the waves in perfect formation. These aren't just any ships. They're the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same floating fortresses that 6 months earlier had launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. On the bridge of the flagship, Akagi stands Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the very man who had led that first wave of devastation over Pearl Harbor. His face bears the confidence of a warrior who has never known defeat. Around him, the controlled chaos of carrier operations unfolds like a deadly ballet. Flight deck crews in colored jerseys swarm over dozens of aircraft. Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all being hastily rearmed and refueled for what should be the decisive blow against American forces. Fuchida watches with satisfaction as ordnance teams load bombs and torpedoes. Fuel hoses snake across the deck like arteries pumping lifeblood into his metal birds of war. The sweet smell of aviation gasoline mixes with the salt air, while the throb of aircraft engines creates a symphony of power. Everything is proceeding according to plan. In just 5 minutes, Admiral Nagumo will give the order to launch. In just 5 minutes, they'll finish what they started at Pearl Harbor. But Mitsuo Fuchida has no idea that these next 5 minutes won't bring victory. They'll bring a technological shock so devastating that it will shatter Japanese naval aviation forever. He doesn't know that high above him, invisible in those scattered clouds, a weapon he never imagined possible is about to change the course of World War II. The question that would haunt Japanese pilots for the rest of the war was already forming in the morning sky. How could American dive bombers, operating from aircraft carriers hundreds of miles away, appear from nowhere and deliver precision strikes that no one thought possible? To understand the shock that was about to unfold, you have to understand just how completely the Japanese dominated the Pacific in 1942. For 6 months, their naval aviation had been unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, Singapore. Victory after victory had proven that Japanese pilots flying Japanese aircraft were simply superior to anything the Americans could field. The heart of this supremacy was the Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter, flown by pilots like Saburo Sakai, already an ace with 60 confirmed victories. These men weren't just skilled, they were legends. They'd spent years honing their craft in the brutal skies over China, learning lessons written in blood and smoke. When they encountered American pilots, the results were predictably one-sided. American fighters were slower, less maneuverable, and their pilots were inexperienced kids fresh from training schools. Standing on Akagi's bridge that morning, Fuchida represented everything the Japanese Navy believed about itself. He was a Pearl Harbor veteran, a master of carrier operations, and a true believer in Japanese naval supremacy. Around him, 4 aircraft carriers operated with clockwork precision, their combined air wings representing over 250 of the finest combat aircraft in the world. But there was something the Japanese didn't know, something that would have chilled Fuchida to the bone if he'd understood what was happening 300 miles to the northeast. The Americans hadn't just been building more ships and training more pilots. They'd been developing weapons and tactics that would exploit the one moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. At 4:30 that morning, in the pre-dawn darkness, something unprecedented had happened. From the flight decks of USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, a new type of aircraft had launched into the darkness. The Douglas SBD Dauntless looked unremarkable compared to sleek Japanese fighters. American pilots even joked about its nickname, slow but deadly. But this ungainly-looking aircraft concealed innovations that Japanese intelligence had never imagined. The most distinctive feature was what looked like Swiss cheese, perforated metal flaps along the trailing edge of each wing. To Japanese observers, these might have seemed like a design flaw. They were actually the key to a tactical revolution. These dive brakes could be deployed during an attack dive, allowing the Dauntless to maintain precise control while plunging toward targets at angles approaching 80 degrees, nearly vertical. But technology was only part of the equation. The real innovation was tactical. American commanders had realized that Japanese combat air patrols could be drawn down to sea level by torpedo bomber attacks, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. It was a deadly game of three-dimensional chess, and the Americans were about to prove they'd learned to play better than their teachers. At 10:20 a.m., everything appeared to be going perfectly for the Japanese. Earlier, American attacks had been beaten off with ease. Torpedo bombers had been slaughtered by Japanese fighters. High-altitude bombers had missed completely. The Americans seemed to be throwing away their aircraft in piecemeal, uncoordinated attacks that only proved Japanese superiority. Admiral Nagumo felt confident enough to continue with his planned second strike. On every flight deck, ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm aircraft. Bombs that had been intended for ground targets on Midway were being swapped out for armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes meant to sink American ships. Aviation gasoline flowed freely as fuel crews topped off tanks for the long flight to find and destroy the American fleet. It was exactly the moment American planners had hoped. 4 Japanese carriers caught in their most vulnerable condition, with armed and fueled aircraft covering every deck, fuel lines snaking everywhere, and ammunition stacked in neat, deadly piles. At 10:22 a.m., a lookout on Akagi screamed a warning that would echo through history. Climax sequence. 5 minutes that changed everything. "Hell divers!" The cry ripped across Akagi's bridge like a physical blow. Mitsuo Fuchida's head snapped up, his eyes searching the scattered clouds above. For a split second, he saw nothing. Then his blood turned to ice. Plunging through the cloud cover at impossible angles came shapes that defied everything he thought he knew about aerial warfare. Not 1 or 2 aircraft, but dozens of them, their wings extended into perfect crucifixes of destruction as they dove at angles no pilot should survive. The morning sun glinted off their propeller spinners as they fell toward his ship like bullets fired from heaven itself. The plump silhouettes of the American Dauntless dive bombers quickly grew larger, Fuchida would later write, his voice still trembling with the memory. And then a number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from their wings. Bombs! Down they came straight toward me. What Fuchida was witnessing was a tactical revolution in action. 48 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from 3 different squadrons had achieved perfect coordination through pure chance. Enterprise's Scouting 6 and Bombing 6 had found the Japanese fleet first, followed moments later by Yorktown's Bombing 3. Together, they represented the most concentrated dive-bombing attack in naval history. The sound was unlike anything the Japanese had ever heard. As each Dauntless deployed its perforated dive brakes, the slotted metal flaps created an unholy shriek that seemed to tear the very air apart. The Swiss cheese holes that had looked like design flaws were actually acoustic weapons, turning each diving bomber into a screaming banshee of destruction. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's attack, had spotted the Japanese formation through a gap in the clouds at exactly 10:22 a.m. "Attack immediately," he radioed, and 37 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives. At nearly the same moment, 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown began their own attack on a different carrier. Lieutenant Norman Dusty Kleiss, a young pilot from Kansas flying his first major combat mission, found himself diving toward the massive form of the carrier Kaga. Through his telescopic bomb sight, he could see Japanese sailors running across the flight deck, their upturned faces white with terror. Armed aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip, fuel hoses still connected, ammunition carts positioned between the planes. It was a bomber pilot's dream target. The mathematics of dive bombing required split-second timing. Kleiss had to judge his altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and target movement while plunging earthward at 250 knots in a 70-degree dive. The perforated dive brakes kept his aircraft stable, but the G-forces pressed him deep into his seat as the carrier grew larger and larger in his sight. At 2,500 feet, Kleiss pressed the bomb release. His 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb separated cleanly from the aircraft, its yellow nose cone gleaming as it continued downward while Kleiss pulled out of his dive with a force that nearly blacked him out. Across the Japanese formation, the impossible was happening. On Akagi, Fuchida threw himself behind a command post as two massive explosions rocked the ship. The first bomb struck just behind the midship elevator. The second hit near the port side of the flight deck. Under normal circumstances, these hits wouldn't have been fatal to a ship as large as Akagi. But with the flight deck crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, the results were catastrophic. Fuchida watched in horror as secondary explosions began chain reacting across his ship. There was a huge hole in the flight deck just behind the amidship elevator, he remembered. The elevator itself, twisted like molten glass, was drooping into the hangar. Deck plates reeled upward in grotesque configurations. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flame and jet-black smoke. The scene was being repeated with terrifying precision on Kaga and Soryu. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading a small section of Enterprise dive bombers, had achieved something no pilot in history had ever done. He scored direct hits on two different enemy aircraft carriers in a single attack. His first bomb penetrated Akagi's flight deck and detonated in the hangar, setting off a chain reaction among stored torpedoes and bombs. Minutes later, he put another bomb through the flight deck of the carrier Soryu. On Soryu, the devastation was immediate and total. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck within minutes, and the ship was transformed into what one survivor called a hell of smoke and flames. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, beloved by his crew, chose to go down with his ship, standing on the bridge sword in hand, calmly singing Kimigayo, the Japanese national anthem, as flames consumed his command. The most shocking aspect wasn't just the destruction, it was the precision. American dive bombers, operating from carriers hundreds of miles away, had achieved accuracy that Japanese planners had thought impossible. The perforated dive brakes that looked so crude had actually enabled a level of bombing precision that turned each Dauntless into a guided missile with a human brain. But perhaps no Japanese pilot experienced the shock of American dive bomber capabilities more dramatically than Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous ace, on August 7, 1942, over Guadalcanal. Flying his Zero at 13,000 feet, Sakai spotted what he thought were 8 American F-4F Wildcat fighters circling below. Easy prey for a pilot with 60 victories. "I was in a trap," Sakai later wrote, his voice still filled with disbelief decades later. The enemy planes were not fighters, but bombers, the Avenger torpedo planes, types I had never seen before. From the rear, they looked exactly like Wildcats, but now they're extra size. What happened next shattered every assumption Japanese pilots had about American bomber aircraft. As Sakai closed for what should have been an easy kill, 8 tail gunners opened fire simultaneously. The Dauntless wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying fortress with defensive firepower that could challenge the best fighter pilots in the world. There was only one thing to do: keep going and open up with everything I had, Sakai remembered. I jammed down on the firing button. Almost at the same moment, every gun in the formation opened up. The planes were only 20 yards in front of me when flames spurted from two bombers. That was all I saw. A violent explosion smashed at my body. I felt as though knives had been thrust savagely into my ears. The world burst into flaming red and I went blind. Multiple .30 caliber bullets had shattered Sakai's canopy and struck him in the head, chest, and legs. One tracer round missed his right eye by less than an inch, melting the rim of his goggles. The tail gunners had expended over 1,000 rounds of ammunition in seconds, turning Japan's greatest ace into a casualty. What followed was one of the most remarkable flights in aviation history. Nearly blind, badly wounded, and with his aircraft riddled with holes, Sakai flew 550 miles back to Rabaul, navigating by instinct and willpower alone. When he finally landed, his fuel tanks were completely empty. He would spend the next 18 months in hospitals, recovering from wounds inflicted by aircraft he had thought were easy targets. In exactly 5 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:27 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the entire balance of power in the Pacific Ocean had shifted forever. 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were now flaming wreckage, their flight decks twisted metal graveyards where moments before they had been symbols of invincible power. Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself being lowered on a stretcher to a rescue boat, both ankles broken from his desperate escape from Akagi's burning bridge. As he was transferred to the cruiser Nagara, he watched his flagship, the ship from which he had coordinated the most successful naval air attack in history, disappear beneath the waves at 4:55 a.m. the next morning, torn apart by torpedoes from her own escort destroyers. The human cost was staggering. Of Akagi's crew of nearly 2,000 men, only 263 would survive. Captain Aoki, who had initially planned to go down with his ship, was finally persuaded to abandon the vessel, but not before the inferno had claimed the lives of every man trapped in the engine rooms below. These weren't just statistics. They were the most experienced naval aviators in the world, irreplaceable veterans whose loss would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the rest of the war. What had made this devastating success possible wasn't just courage or luck. It was a technological revolution that Japanese intelligence had completely missed. The Douglas SBD Dauntless represented innovations that seemed minor but proved tactically decisive. Those perforated dive brakes, the Swiss cheese flaps that looked so crude, allowed American pilots to maintain control during dives at angles the Japanese had thought impossible. A typical attack run began at 18,000 feet and continued at angles approaching 80 degrees until the pilot pulled out at just 1,800 feet above the target. The bomb displacement gear ensured that even in these extreme dives, the 1,000-pound bombs would clear the propeller and strike with devastating accuracy. But perhaps most importantly, the Dauntless was designed from the beginning as a defensive fighter as well as a bomber. The twin 50 caliber machine guns in the nose gave pilots formidable forward firepower, while the twin 30 caliber guns in the rear cockpit created crossfire that could challenge the best enemy fighters. This wasn't just a bomber that could defend itself. It was a multi-role aircraft that redefined what carrier aviation could accomplish. For Japanese pilots like Saburo Sakai, the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical wounds. Men who had dominated the skies for 6 months suddenly found themselves outgunned by aircraft they had dismissed as inferior. The confidence that had carried them through victory after victory evaporated in minutes of defensive fire from formations of slow American bombers. Sakai would never fully recover from his encounter with SBD tailgunners. Though he returned to combat duty, He was no longer the invincible ace who had terrorized Allied pilots across the Pacific. The 18 months he spent in hospitals gave him time to reflect on how completely his understanding of air warfare had been shattered by perforated dive breaks and defensive firepower he had never imagined possible. For American pilots like Dusty Kleiss, that morning over Midway proved that technological innovation combined with tactical surprise could overcome any enemy, no matter how experienced or confident. Kleiss would become one of only 2 pilots in history to score hits on 2 different aircraft carriers in a single day. But more importantly, he had participated in proving that American naval aviation could not just compete with the Japanese, it could dominate them. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific. With 4 fleet carriers destroyed and their most experienced pilots dead or wounded, the Imperial Japanese Navy was forced into a defensive posture from which it would never recover. Every subsequent battle would be fought on American terms, with American dive bombers providing the precision strike capability that made island-hopping campaigns possible. The technological lessons were equally profound. The success of the SBD Dauntless proved that specialized dive bombers, properly designed and tactically employed, could achieve levels of precision that changed naval warfare forever. Japanese attempts to develop equivalent aircraft would fail, partly because they never fully understood the innovations that made the Dauntless so effective. The story of Japanese pilots being stunned by American dive bombers offers timeless lessons about technological surprise and tactical innovation. In an era where military superiority can shift overnight due to unexpected innovations, the tale of perforated dive breaks and precision bombing serves as a reminder that confidence based on past success can become a fatal weakness. The 5 minutes that changed everything at Midway demonstrate how quickly the balance of power can shift when technological innovation meets tactical surprise. The Japanese pilots who had dominated the Pacific found themselves facing weapons and tactics they had never imagined, delivered by enemies they had underestimated. Today, when we look at the preserved SBD Dauntless bombers in museums, it's easy to see just another World War II aircraft. But for the Japanese pilots who faced them in combat, these ungainly-looking planes with their perforated wings represented something far more terrifying, proof that technological superiority could vanish in an instant, and that even the most confident warriors could find themselves stunned by innovations they never saw coming. The next time you hear about military technological developments or tactical innovations, remember Mitsuo Fuchida crawling behind that command post as bombs fell around him, or Saburo Sakai flying 550 miles home nearly blind. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won by the strongest or the bravest. They're won by those who understand that in warfare, as in life, the capacity to surprise can be more powerful than any weapon. What do you think was the most important factor in American dive bomber success? The technological innovations, the tactical surprise, or the courage of individual pilots? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the moments when technology and human courage changed history forever. Next week, we'll explore how American submarine warfare evolved to counter Japanese innovations in the same Pacific theater. Until then, remember that sometimes the most dramatic victories come from the weapons nobody sees coming.